But welcome, everybody. My name is Anita Allen, and I'm a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm also a professor of philosophy. I'm currently serving as deputy dean as well, so I'm a very busy person. But glad to be here on Football Saturday at Princeton University. I think I'm required to give a disclaimer. I am here representing myself, and although I'm a member of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, I do not represent President Obama today, nor the Commission. All views are strictly my own. Done my duty now. This concurrent panel is devoted to the topic, preventing unintended pregnancies. Preventing unintended pregnancies. We live in a very, very diverse world of diverse people. Men and women, secular religious, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, gay and straight, lawyer, lay, town and gown, advocate, scholar, American, European, black, white, yellow, and red, and a lot of that diversity is represented by our panel today. So we're very fortunate to have a diverse panel with very diverse perspectives. People from many walks of life and perspectives believe in the goal of reducing the number of unintended pregnancies. What's not to like about that goal? Wouldn't that goal, if successful, solve the problem of abortion, thereby ending the acrimony, the moral turmoil, and also the political divisiveness? Well, maybe and maybe not, because abortion is controversial, but abstinence is controversial, and contraception is controversial as well. What if it turns out that the goal of preventing unintended pregnancies is just as divisive and controversial as the goal of ending abortion itself? Now, the organizers of this conference thought it would be very nice to begin our discussion with some facts, some statistics, some data. And for that reason, we're lucky to have Professor James Trussell from Princeton's Office of Population Research to speak first, to give us some common factual background. But this session is not going to be an hour and a half of data crunching or numbers. We're going to get beyond the statistics and the facts and the dueling facts and very quickly get into a conversation among the panelists about their individual perspectives on preventing unintended pregnancies that are based on their life experiences, their work experiences. The order of the speakers is going to be this. Professor Kimberly Mutcherson, here in the green blouse, from Rutgers Camden Law School will speak first, and she will talk to us about law and policy issues. Kimberly teaches a very, very popular class called Babies and Baby Making. She's taught it at her own university and also at mine, it happens. Sarah Brown from the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancies is going to talk to us about some of the pushback that she's experienced on the goal of reducing unintended pregnancies. And she and I are color coordinated today, strictly by chance. Father Joseph Tham from the Regina Apostolorum University in Rome will talk to us about Catholic perspectives on pregnancy prevention inside and outside the context of marriage. So I think all of these discussions will really help us to understand better the ethics and the values and the policies affecting unwanted pregnancies or unintended pregnancies. I apologize in advance if I have to, at some point, cut someone off. We have a very large panel, a large audience, and I want everyone to have a chance to speak. The panelists have committed themselves to crisp 10-minute presentations, leaving ample time, in theory, for all of us, all of you, to have a chance to go to the mic and ask a question or react to the presentation. So, with that said, we can start now. Professor Trussell.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased that the organizers, the powers that be of this conference allowed me, I'm the only person allowed to give a PowerPoint presentation, but there are also handouts of my presentation there so you can take them away. So how are unintended pregnancies defined? How are they measured in the United States? And interestingly enough, I can guarantee you that almost all of you will be surprised about the way they're defined. It's not what you think. Women are not asked whether their pregnancy was intended or not. Instead, women are asked, at the time you became pregnant, now this is asked both in a national survey of American women, nationally representative survey of American women, and it's also asked in a survey of abortion patients by the Guttmacher Institute, because abortions are only 50% of them are reported in this national survey. So you have to get two different data sources. But women are asked identical questions. At the time you became pregnant, thinking back to the time you became pregnant, did you ever want to have a child, or did you want to have another child, depending upon whether you had had children or not? If the answer to that question is no, I didn't want to have a child, or no, I didn't want to have another child, then those are classified as unwanted. These are number failures. Women are having more children, more pregnancies than they wanted. If the answer to that question is yes, then women are asked whether it came at about the same time, at about the right time, or later, or if it came too soon. If they came too soon, then they're classified as mistimed, and the sum of those two is unintended. So you can see what is at issue here is a timing question. They weren't asked whether they were happy or unhappy. They weren't asked whether this pregnancy would have an adverse impact on their life, although these questions are also asked. When they are compared, the answers are compared, there is a substantial agreement, but by no means total agreement. But this is the set, this is what is used to track unintended pregnancies over time in the United States by the Guttmacher Institute. Now, half of all pregnancies are still unintended, and the emphasis here is on the word still. 30 years, the same result. Half of all pregnancies are unintended. And I'm grateful to my colleagues from the Guttmacher Institute for giving me these slides, because these data have not yet been published. The percent of, this is just comparing the last two estimates, 2001 and 2006. The percent of all pregnancies unintended was 47% in 2001 and 49% in 2006. The unintended pregnancy rate, that's the rate per 1,000 women, or converting it to percents, 4.9% of all pregnancies were unintended in 2001. That's now risen. It hasn't gone down. It's going the wrong way. It's now 5.5% of all pregnancies. In 2001, 39% of these pregnancies ended in abortion. That dropped in 2006 to 34%. Now, let's look at what happened by income. Well, the disparity by income grew. So this is so things got worse for people who were the poorest. There's significant disparity by education. Those with less than a high school education are about more than 3 times as likely to have an unintended pregnancy. The disparity didn't grow, but it certainly still persists. And there's a significant disparity by race and ethnicity, where black and Hispanic women have significantly higher rates of unintended pregnancy than white women. So in summary, half of all pregnancies are still unintended. The unintended pregnancy rate increased. The teen unintended rate declined. but most pregnancies among teens are still unintended. There are large disparities by income, education, and race, and a significant decrease in the percentage of unintended pregnancies ending in abortion. Now, let's look then at what methods of contraception women in the United States who are at risk of an unintended pregnancy are using. You can see that the most popular method, and there's been little change from 2002 to 2006 to 8, the most popular method used by a quarter of all women is pill, almost tied by those using female sterilization. About 15% are using the condom. The no method is an interesting category, which I'm going to single out, because although only 11% of women are using no method, what fraction of all unintended pregnancies do they contribute? 50%. So it's a very large proportion is contributed by people who use no method, and the other half are contributed by people using a method, that is, contraceptive failures. Sorry?
Why it doesn't add up to 100?
Because I left off the less popular methods. I listed only the most popular methods. It does eventually add up to 100%. Now, if we look at the failure rates, we can see why it is that women who use no method contribute so many unintended pregnancies, because about 85% of them will get pregnant in a year. But these other contraceptive failure rates might come as some considerable surprise to you. The pill, the patch, and the ring, the first year probability of failure, 9%. 9%. And you might think, well, gosh, the pill it works extremely well. It works extremely well if it is used, actually used. The same as the condom. It works much better when it's on the penis than when it's in the drawer. Now, I single out even Depo-Provera, which is an injection every 3 months. The first year probability of failure is 6%, extremely high. Now, in contrast, these bottom three down here, Paragard, IUD, Mirena, IUS, and Implanon, these require no adherence on the part of the woman. They're forgettable contraceptives. Once they're there, you can just completely forget about them. And look at these failure rates, extremely, extremely low. But what's the problem with this picture? How many people in the U.S. use these three methods? Virtually nobody. So people are using, the most popular method is the pill, which has a 9% failure rate. The least popular reversible methods are these long-acting, forgettable contraceptives, extremely good pregnancy protection, but not used. And so the conclusion, again, the most effective reversible methods are used by only a small fraction of women, and without a substantial increase in the use of these methods, and I don't mean coercing women to use them, unless we can figure out some way to make them attractive, there will be no decrease in the unintended pregnancy rate. Now, that's not just me out howling in the wilderness. There's a broad consensus in the entire family planning community that this statement is true. There is, although we've been saying it for 30 years, and still only a small percentage use these highly effective methods. In the United Kingdom, there is an explicit goal, a national commitment to getting more people to use these highly effective long-acting methods, but I will also state they haven't had that much success either, even though in the United Kingdom, contraception is completely free. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before we move off the facts, I think the audience may have a question which I had for you, which is, are the three most effective methods available in the United States?
Oh, yes.
And are they proven safe?
Oh, yes, they're extremely safe. They're all FDA approved. It's just that they're not very widely used.
Okay, good. Kimberly Mutcherson.
So I'm going to discipline myself even though I know Anita's going to shut me down when I've used all my time, and I'm going to start my stopwatch here on my cell phone. That's why my cell phone is out. I'm not Facebooking or anything like that. So first I want to thank Anita for moderating this panel, and Francis and all the other folks who put this event together. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to engage in these conversations, which I think are obviously important, and hopefully will be fruitful at the end of our time together. So I want to start in the sort of best American reality television tradition by giving a bit of a confession. And the confession is that I came here today extraordinarily nervous and very full of trepidation about participating in this event, or I should say I came yesterday that way. And it's not because I've never had conversations across difference, because I've had lots of those conversations, but they tend to happen in much smaller spaces and in much less public forums. It's also the case that I was a little bit cynical about the conference title and what it was going to mean in practice when everybody got into a room together. And I was really excited by yesterday's conversations, especially on the first panel, and I went back to the hotel last night and actually ended up revising my talk pretty substantially given those conversations. So one of the things that I want to do before I get into any of the meat here is to start by being clear about where I'm coming from, about what matters to me in the context of this discussion about reproductive choice and about reproductive justice. And I do think that that's what we're talking about here. And I'll have some substantial overlap, I think, with some of the things that Dorothy said on the earlier panel today. So I'll say ditto to lots of the stuff that she put on the table. So here are some of the things that I want to be very clear about. I come to this material and to this discussion with a few very firm beliefs. First, that there are rights that are at stake here, that those rights are both human rights and constitutional rights, that exercising autonomous choice in matters of reproductive decision-making is one of those rights, that choice is always exercised within constraints, and that it is a very slippery concept in a world in which social inequalities act as a restraint on choice for lots and lots of people, especially women. That the role of government in regulating intimacy across a range of issues should be limited, and as Maggie Little said yesterday, and as she has written about very eloquently, pregnancy is obviously an intimacy and an intimate act. And then finally, and perhaps foremost, while there may be many reasons to desire a reduction in the number of unintended pregnancies that take place in this country, the most important of these reasons, for me, is the real consequences for women that come from becoming pregnant at a time when they are not interested in or prepared to carry that pregnancy to term. So while there's absolutely value in the discussion of reducing unintended pregnancies as a way of finding common ground with people who find abortion morally objectionable, for me, that value is really a byproduct. It's not a focus of a discussion on reducing unintended pregnancies. Now, last night at dinner, someone spoke of a human tendency to be driven by what we fear and not by what we want. So I want to be really clear about what I want. What I want for all women is that they should be able to function as full and equal citizens in our polity, and I have no doubt that being allowed and able to exercise control over their reproductive destinies is a basic pillar of women's equality. And at least some members of the United States Supreme Court agree with me on that. So I'm not saying that other people here don't recognize the intrinsic value of having conversations about how women can be treated as full and equal citizens, but I want to make very sure that that's an explicit part of the conversation that we have in this room right now. So that being said, by way of introduction, my focus for my few minutes is going to be twofold. One, I want to really quickly, and without case names, walk through some of the ways in which the law has and can facilitate a reduction in the number of unintended pregnancies in our country. And then I want to spend some time explaining, I think reinforcing my belief that we should focus on reducing unintended pregnancies because of their impact on women's lives and because it's the right thing to do. And that using this issue as a bridge kind of to the other side, meaning as a bridge to folks who oppose abortion in most, if not all cases, might actually just be a bridge to nowhere. So, which sounds very cynical, I realize. So here's my starting point in terms of the law. Broadly speaking, the law supports access to contraception and tools of family planning, at least the law in the United States. And the law can be said to stand for the proposition that individuals should be able to make decisions about pregnancy and childbearing with a significant measure of privacy. And while it's obviously the case that courts have become much less protective of the right to abortion over the years since Roe versus Wade, they have maintained a pretty consistent level of protection for contraceptive access. Some issues that come into play when we talk about young people, but still access is available in lots of ways. So if I had a lot of time, I would spend some of that time sketching out the broader social justice agenda that almost certainly needs to be at the heart of a comprehensive discussion of reducing unintended pregnancies. And that full conversation is a conversation about racism and sexism and classism and violence and health disparities and economic disenfranchisement and failed public schools, all sorts of things. But I have 10 minutes. Actually, now I have 5 minutes. So I can't do all of those things. So let me just point out a few different places where I think the law is really relevant here. One is on the question of payment or insurance as an access issues, and I'm going to focus really on access. Payment and insurance. 2 is on the availability of sex education, and 3 is in the approval of new contraceptive methods. So in the payment and insurance question, I think it's obviously the case that avoiding pregnancy goes deeper than having theoretical access to the tools of contraception. And so one of the places that we're going to run into trouble is where people feel like they don't have what it takes in terms of cost in order to cover contraception. So that access without means is kind of meaningless. And one of the things that we've done very successfully, I think, with the law is push for more mandates to cover contraception, particularly in the context of insurance coverage. And Medicaid also provides funding, but there are lots of issues with eligibility requirements. There are issues with reimbursement levels, and so sometimes you don't have the amount of providers that we would want who are working with Medicaid patients. But even when we have these ways in which people can pay for what they want in terms of avoiding pregnancy, there are some people of reproductive age who are going to fall through the cracks. One, there's just no guarantee that people are going to have the money to pay for the tools of contraception, so you may not be able, you may have insurance and not be able to afford the copay for your birth control. That some women of men and women of reproductive age lack insurance or are otherwise unable to cover that cost. That women may be unable to negotiate the terms of their sexual relationships, so that even if they can have access to contraceptive tools, they can't actually use them when they're having sex, or get the person who they're having sex with to use them. And it's also the case that some people may find it difficult to find a method of pregnancy avoidance with which they're comfortable. Right? So one of the things that I was thinking in the first presentation is, if we have these really reliable methods that women are not using, well, maybe we need to think about what's going on there that drives women not to use those really reliable methods. So that's the kind of money issue. The second thing I wanted to talk about is comprehensive sex education. And by this I mean that access without knowledge can also be meaningless. That the fight to ensure that young people have access to comprehensive sex education continues. We're still engaged in these turf battles about abstinence-only education. And while I certainly recognize that the best way to avoid getting pregnant when you don't want to be pregnant, and the best way to avoid getting a sexually transmitted disease is by not having sex, and I define sex very broadly there, right? I'm not Bill Clinton about what does sex mean. It's the case that the law doesn't always ensure that young folks have the kind of information that they need so that they can engage in meaningful choice. And then finally, on the question of availability of new contraceptive methods, that access without good tools can also be meaningless. So there have been lots of power plays with women's lives when it comes to approving forms of contraception. So I'm thinking specifically here about the battle over-the-counter emergency contraception for women. And there's an ongoing struggle in terms of research to get the kind of research on women-controlled means of contraception that may, in fact, be really useful, not just for avoiding pregnancy, but my background is also in HIV work, in providing tools that can help women avoid sexually transmitted infections. So in my last bit of time, what I want to do is focus on why I think that the conversation here needs to be one on women as citizens and not one that's focused on women as people who have abortions. So in yesterday's session, in the very first session, David Gussie made reference to dreaming of a world without abortion. And that phrase really resonated with me. I actually talked to him about it afterwards, and it really stuck with me. And it seems to me that agreeing about unintended pregnancies is fundamentally not a conversation about abortion. So while reducing the number of unintended pregnancies in this country is a laudable goal, it is absolutely not a panacea. Unintended pregnancies will always happen, unless we become a world in which we sterilize people at birth in order to strictly control fertility, and maybe that's where we're going, I don't know. There will always be women, young, old, everywhere in between, all across the economic spectrum, who become pregnant and don't want to carry those pregnancies to term. We can't make that go away. People like to have sex that can create babies, and they won't always be careful about it, and sometimes they'll take care, and they'll still get pregnant. So some people become pregnant on purpose, and then in addition to that, some people become pregnant on purpose and then decide for a range of reasons that they don't wish to remain pregnant. And for those women, we still need to be able to have a conversation about abortion. Because we will always still have this category of pregnancies that people either don't want or that pose risk to a pregnant woman's life or her health, and that will require termination. So I'm almost done, Anita. I know I'm running early.
You're doing great.
So in the end, I think we should pursue an agenda that reduces unintended pregnancies because we think that it brings benefit to women, but not because we think that it can spare us from having an ongoing debate about access to safe and legal abortion in this country, because it just won't. In fact, the abortion debate in meaningful and painful ways, I think, has sometimes impeded efforts to help women of childbearing age avoid pregnancy. So I don't dream of a world without abortion because I don't think that this world is a place where such a dream could come to fruition. Rather, and I think that David Gushing might agree with me on these things, I dream of a world without gender oppression, a world without violence against women, a world without deep social inequality. And if we ended all of these things, that would almost certainly have an impact on the abortion rate in this country, though none of them alone or in conjunction with each other will actually bring that rate down to zero. So if we could collectively get rid of things, these structural inequalities that adversely impact so many women's lives, we would still be fighting about the remaining number of women, small though it may be, who desire access to safe and legal abortion.
Thank you. Sarah.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. I think I share the appreciation everybody expresses. I got to leave Washington, D.C. You have to understand what a pleasure that is. It's a very contentious city. I think I'm probably the first speaker in this day and a half so far who's not an academic, with the exception, I think, of my colleague to my left. Maybe there have been a couple of others, but I'm not a lawyer. I work very much sort of in the trenches of public policy, entertainment, media, and sort of related issues. So I think I might sound a little more kind of real world and less academic than some of the other speakers, particularly yesterday. Let me be clear about my own personal position. I believe that that increasing the percentage of pregnancies that are actively sought and desired and welcomed by both women and men is an important and achievable social goal. Many people at this conference want to reduce the 1.2 million abortions every year. My parallel and antecedent goal is to reduce the 3 million plus pregnancies every year that women report are unintended, over 1 million of which result in or lead to abortion. So my focus is on going upstream to address the antecedent, the precursors of many, although of course not all abortions. Now, if we succeeded in doing that, not 100%, but even making a measurable progress in the proportion of pregnancies and births that are reported by women and men as fully wanted and intended, we would reap a large number of benefits. I'm not going to spell them out, I'll just give you the headings. Benefits in family structures that benefit children, benefits in health through a greater ability to attend to preconception care and prenatal care, reducing thereby low birth weight, infant mortality, and other risks. We would see a decrease in relationship stress and trauma that is well documented to follow the diagnosis of an unintended pregnancy. We would witness a decrease in poverty, especially through enhanced educational attainment, because unintended pregnancy is a principal reason, not the only reason, for not only dropping out of high school, but also out of two-year colleges, which are now virtually essential, I think, for people who were not able to afford or attend even a four-year college. I think that's a principal pathway where we link this to poverty. And of course, unintended pregnancy can also decrease abortion, especially, as the previous presentations have emphasized, when contraception and family planning are widely available and accepted, and, to underscore Professor Trussell's point, when the best methods are used. And I hope we can return to that. Now, to be clear, I'm pro-choice, but I think like most Americans and many people at this conference, I understand its moral complexity, and I would prefer that we have fewer, not by making it illegal or inaccessible or shameful, but by reducing the incidence of the unplanned, distressing, stressful pregnancies that are behind the vast majority of abortions. So, over many years and through many institutions, I have worked on this issue of promoting planned and intended pregnancy, and I want to give you a few reports from the front. As Anita said, I sort of think of this as a fairly straightforward public health proposition, but indeed, in this country, nothing is simple. There's always pushback. First of all, many people have no idea what this phrase unintended means. Not only do they not understand the questions on the National Survey of Family Growth, they don't even know what you mean. They think you mean somehow maybe unwanted children, or what does that mean? Is it unplanned? And what do you mean about planning that? I spend an enormous amount of time explaining the words. People wonder who said it's unplanned or unintended. Did some other person label that woman as having an unintended pregnancy? And so we have to explain again what we went through earlier about how this is what women themselves report. I have often been challenged about this whole notion of planning or not planning children. The pregnancy and children are gifts of God. They are miracles of life. And they just are. They are separate from these constructs of whether they're planned or not. Very similar to this, we hear sometimes that planning a pregnancy, in fact, is the wrong idea. It makes it sound utilitarian. It sort of removes it from the preciousness of life. It removes the mystery. And I really, really disagree with that. Ruth Marcus, who's a wonderful op-ed writer in the Post, wrote a number of years ago, I took it off my lampshade. I tape things to my lampshade that I think are especially clear. She said, it's odd that we live in a culture that values planning in everything from education to retirement to weddings. Yet we're expected to believe that starting a family is something that's supposed to just happen without preparation or choice. I agree with Ruth. I think perhaps most distressing to me in the trenches is the increasing blurring of the difference in people's understanding between pregnancy planning and prevention and interrupting an established pregnancy. I find this commonly on Capitol Hill. I find it in just sort of the land in general. If someone says family planning, they say, I'm sorry, we're not going to discuss abortion. I say, I'm not discussing abortion. I'm talking about going upstream, planning, preventing pregnancy in the first place, not what we do once an established pregnancy is diagnosed. There has been a very, very, so I don't know if it's intentional, but it just is now unclear in America the difference between prevention and intervention. I think much to the detriment of preventing unintended pregnancy. Now, to conclude, despite my very strong belief in the power of prevention, and I must remind you, incidentally, that the CDC has referred to the development of modern contraception as one of the 10 greatest public health advances of the last century, on a par with antibiotics and modern sanitation. These are database conclusions. This isn't just an ideological exercise. That as powerful as I think this tool is, and as critical as it is to prevention, the fact is that Americans are very confused about all this. Again, I mentioned they're confused about the relationship between prevention and intervention abortion. They don't know much about contraception. We can return to these slides and these methods that are used and not used. Americans grossly overestimate the risks and side effects of contraception. They are largely ignorant of the benefits of contraception. And when they discuss the risk of contraception, it's a freestanding argument. It is never placed against the risks of what we're trying to postpone, which is pregnancy. Virtually all the risks that attach to contraception are smaller than any of the risks that attach to pregnancy. So we have, in addition to that, as Kim pointed out a minute ago, in addition to all of this confusion, we have a non-system of family planning in this country. Contraception is expensive, it's patchwork, and it's not fully integrated into women's health. Within the last year, I was in, what do they say, a mid-sized U.S. city which shall remain nameless. And I was taken on a tour of the brand new, spanking new public health department. It was really great. It was beautifully laid out, very patient-centered. We had pediatrics, preventive services, a geriatric service that was just luminous, water control, everything. And I just said in passing, where's the family planning clinic? And they said, oh, well, that's not in this building. You have to go out the door and you turn left and you go back next to Acme Tire and Fan Belt or whatever it was. And over there was the family planning clinic. And I thought, that's the metaphor for what in many parts of the world is considered just basic public health. So I believe that one of the major reasons, certainly not the only one, the major reasons we have 1.2 million abortions in this country is that we have not been willing to focus on the powerful intervention of birth control as an effective way to achieve many goals that I ticked off, in addition to reducing abortion. Thank you.
We will next hear from Father Joseph Tham from, I regret to inform you, another academic institution, the Regina Apostolorum
non-academic.
in Rome. Father.
Thank you, Anita, and the panelists, and also thank you for the organizers for inviting me. It's interesting that they invite someone in the caller to speak on sexuality. It sounds like it's funny almost. Probably the only celibate person in this room. They asked me to talk on sex, but I think it's also good to know that because. Perhaps we don't have to have that experience in order to talk about it, because I think doctors do not have to experience every medical condition to be able to be a good doctor. And so in the same way, I think we could have, from my perspective, a more objective perspective as well, like a doctor, on this. So I've been asked to talk about the Catholic understanding of these issues. I've been thinking about it. I think there are, especially about convergence or common ground, there are three points I think I could think that there could be common ground, even though it seems like I probably disagree with a lot of things that has been said here. One is reason, the other is love, and the third one is freedom. Those are the 3 points I'm going to touch on. The first one is reason. In the sense that I think the Catholic approach to these issues are based on reason, and also believe that there is a way to dialogue, to talk about these things, because we basically seek the truth. And that by that we mean that there's ways that we could actually talk, because we are agreeing that there's something that is objective out there that we could all agree on. And this truth comes from science, comes from understanding of human nature, things that we share, and that's what we could talk about in human science. We could disagree about the facts, but then there's always a way to dialogue and communicate. And I think that's a reason for this Congress, is that if we are open mind about truth, then we can discover that truth. Because yesterday I was sitting beside Frances, and she was saying that sometimes it seems like that pro-life people and the pro-choice people are presented with the same facts, but then they draw very different conclusions. It's almost like the facts don't work. I think on one level that's true, but I think we could also say that if it is true, then we just have to kind of go lower, maybe look at points where we converge or understand, and we could have dialogue and agreement, and then work from there, saying, like, if this is what we don't agree, we can go further down and say, okay, where do we agree, and start from there, and work our way up, because we really believe that reason is a gift that we all have, and we could all use them in the same way. The Catholic position also on this, on reason and faith. Faith is not to be just kind of like God tells us what to do and then we do it. But it also is a way of saying that there is reason in itself is not able to, at times, work all the time because we're not robots. If we were all logical 100%, we would all agree all the time because we just can't say, okay, you're wrong here, and just make a mechanical, computerized calculation. We will all agree. The reason we sometimes disagree is because we have the complex beings, mind work differently, their interests, their desires, their will interferes. Basically, according to Christian tradition, this is our fallen human nature, that we basically are unable to see the truth clearly and distinctly. So that's why faith comes in and helps us, enlightens reason, so that we could basically discover the truth in a better way. So that's reason. So I think reason is a point of convergence that by the fact that without reason we can't really dialogue. The second point is love. I think it's interesting in this Congress we talk about a lot of times about sex, but I think the main issue here is love, okay? Because a lot of times we talk about sex removed from love. And whereas I think the church comes from a different perspective, it looks at sex as only a part, an integral part of our human condition, but has to be understood in the perspective of human love. That, like I think one of the church fathers, St. Augustine, said, this is basically love is what we want. We all want to be loved, and we all want to love and be loved. Okay, that's the common ground, I think, that we all could agree. And I would say that Christian understanding of love is very, I guess, a very high standard, that love implies a certain totality of your being. It requires commitment, even lifelong commitment, that is durable, that it should last, for a long time, and it's not just something passing. And there are many different characteristics of this love. It's unconditional in some way. Love is opposed to selfishness. It means that you give yourself totally to the other person. And I would say, in this understanding of love, I would say, in the practice, that's why it promotes, on the one hand, fidelity in marriage and abstinence in basically in the premarital stage. And so that's kind of like the vision that we have on human love, that this is what is a high calling that we have as human beings to basically reach up to this level of love that we have. And in that sense, it is against some of these premarital sex or contraception and so on. So I can't really in 10 minutes explain why the church disagrees on those issues, but that's basically is in perspective of love. So I think that's possibly an area that we could discuss. What's the meaning of sex and love, and what we could agree on, and what we could basically move and further discuss. And then the third point is basically about freedom. Once again, the church does not deny human freedom. It really believes that we are free, truly free, to act responsibly, free to, but freedom is always in truth and love. Free to act according to our human condition, to basically act in truth, and to act to love more. And in that sense, freedom is not absolute, but it's also restricted by our condition. In that sense, we're saying that we are free to choose to do the good things in our lives, and we're free to abstain from things that we think are harmful for us. And that's true freedom in terms of exercising that ability to exercise according to the truth of our human nature. And in that sense, I think there's an argument there about abstinence and fidelity. It's basically that. Obviously, nobody's going to stop you from doing what you want. But the ideal is that we believe that men and women are free, and they should be able to control themselves. We are not like, in some way, animals with animal instincts only. We are able to basically decide rationally, this is good for me and that's not good for me. If that's the case, then the danger is also always the government trying to impose on us and say, we have to do it this way, no other way. And that's a question there. And so I think ultimately, the question on this issue is basically a different, I guess a more higher, I'm not sure if it's higher, but a different vision of human sexuality that does not look at sexuality as something base, as something very sublime, something very important in our lives. Sometimes we hear about safe sex, that sex has to be safe. But then I think about that. It means that if, say, we have to protect ourselves by having safe sex, it means that sex is somehow dangerous. Right? And that's something wrong with that. If sex, instead of something should be beautiful and sublime, is now regarded as something that you have to be aware of, have to defend against, because it's dangerous. And so I think that's basically the vision that I think the Catholic Church in particular is trying to address. And so I think, in conclusion, those are the three areas I think we could have some kind of discussion, continued discussion. The reasonableness, the ability to reason, the idea of love, and also the concept of freedom and responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I just had two clarifying questions I wanted to ask the panelists, and I also want to give them a chance to have questions for one another to ask those questions. And I just want to start with Father Tham. I just want to ask you rather directly, because you didn't directly state it, but I think it's implicit.
Right.
But is it the case that under Catholic doctrine, the use of birth control is immoral, considered immoral,
right,
whether inside of marriage or outside of marriage? Please clarify us. That's just the position the
right.
Church takes on this.
Okay, actually all the church documents, when it talks about contraception, is about marriage.
Marriage.
Okay, so definitely in marriage is basically sinful.
Sinful in marriage.
Right, in marriage.
Okay.
When it's outside of marriage, there's still a debate going on as to whether it is an additional sin or is it included in the sin of fornication. So basically, it's a subtle distinction, but it's wrong in general because the very act of having sex outside marriage is no good. Okay, but whether contraception adds to that or not is another issue that has not been settled. It's not settled. Okay.
Okay, so outside of marriage, sex outside of marriage is itself a sin, and
right.
maybe sex outside of marriage with birth control may be an additional sin or a part of the same sin.
Right, exactly.
Inside of marriage, where one assumes commitment and love and trust, nonetheless, birth control is also a sin.
Right, exactly.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Then my question it's actually a question for Kim and Sarah together. Both of you indicated that you're pro-choice, and yet, Kim, your perspective is more emphatic about individual rights and human rights and citizenship for women. And Sarah, your perspective emphasizes more the public health dimension. So what I'm wondering is there any tension between the public health perspective on unintended pregnancy prevention and the rights-oriented women as citizens perspective? Lawyers like myself, we hate to ask questions to which we don't know the answer. But I'm generally not certain whether there is any tension between these two sort of pro-choice stances, that which emphasizes public health and that which emphasizes citizenship.
I don't think that there is a tension there. I think that particularly if you think about health as a human rights concept, that there are lots of ways in which what we think, the ways in which we configure rights, because they also have, they create these very good consequences for people, right? And that's the way I think about it. So that if we think about equality and if we think about positioning people so that a lot of the sort of structural ways in which people suffer in this country cease to exist, that the consequence of that is a much healthier populace in a lot of ways.
You know, I think about how people come to a point of view for different reasons. I mean, for example, on the subject of teenage pregnancy and childbearing, some people object or want it to decrease, object to, think it's a problem because so many of those teen pregnancies and births are non-marital. Some people are concerned about it because of its link to poverty. Some people are concerned about it because, in particular, of the consequences for children of teen mothers. And there are many others as well. And my view is that all of those are true and all are powerful and have merit. And I think, in fact, in this issue of the merit of preventing unintended pregnancy or reducing it, I welcome as many platforms by which people might come to this and see rarely any conflict among them. But maybe that's because I'm not an academic and I haven't analyzed it. It just seems intuitively to me that that's not a problem.
James, if I could, on the issue of the unpopular but highly effective methods of birth control, could the combination of the more invasive character of the birth control, having to insert something through one's cervix into one's uterus, it may strike women as a big deal and create a certain amount of anxiety or concerns or fears. And also combining that with the history of the whole Balkan Shield fiasco. You know, many women of my generation are infertile because they used IUDs, and yet now it looks like, well, maybe the IUDs is the best way of preventing pregnancy. It may also be viewed perhaps inappropriately or hysterically as a great way to get pelvic inflammatory disease. So help us to understand the possible need to move women away from their anxieties about the IUD and toward a more openness towards something which is going to be the best means of birth control.
Well, there certainly are many reasons why these methods aren't more popular. One of the strongest ones is misperceptions about them. Sarah mentioned this, and I mean the misperceptions are many. I mean, I have a colleague who did qualitative research on intrauterine contraceptives, and the people in the group thought that, they might be this big. And so who's going to want something that big? Or people see the inserter and think that the whole thing is going to go up into the uterus, when of course it's only the tiny little bit at the end. There's no doubt that the fact that they're invasive is a put-off. It's also cost is a put-off, because not all of these methods are covered by insurance, and of course many women don't have insurance. One of the good things that came from healthcare reform, just to remind those of you who don't know, is that preventive health services under all insurance plans are now forbidden to charge a deductible or a copay for preventive health services. So they're all free, completely free. Now, what is a preventive health service? So far, everything that is defined by the U.S. Preventive Health Services Task Force as a preventive service rated an A or a B, meaning they're good things, is covered. Contraception, however, is not there. Why is it not there? It's not because the task force considered contraception and said, oh no. It was because they had never been asked to consider it. And at least the people on the task force to whom I've talked said it's a duh. I mean, what else would it be? It's not a breakfast cereal. So The Secretary of Health and Human Services has appointed a task force of the Institute of Medicine, which is to report back on what additional women's services should be considered to be preventive health services. Many of us believe that contraception is a preventive health service. And what that would mean is that healthcare reform would have given women in America contraception with no copay and no deductible. That's a huge gain.
Now we can have some audience participation. So there's a microphone here. Please identify yourself. And if you want to address your question to a particular panelist, you may do that. Or you may.
Holy cow.
Okay, so you have a question for. Okay, so let me take then this 1 second, and if you have a question for the panelist, yeah.
Yes, I basically to James. I think there is also, I'm sure you're aware of this, difference between what you mentioned about the use of contraceptives to prevent unplanned pregnancy, but also the promotion of that as a public policy. Because whereas this might be true, I agree with the statement. There's, I think, the study that you did with Raymond in 2008 showed that increased policies to promote emergency contraception has not really reduced the rate of unplanned pregnancy. I just wonder if you have
yeah, that's correct. Many of us hoped that emergency contraception would reduce unintended pregnancy and abortion. It turns out now that there are 12 studies, randomized trials that show that it did not. The reason that it did not, almost surely, is that the methods themselves are not all that effective, but much more importantly, women did not use emergency contraception even when it was given to them for free to have at home. They didn't use it for all acts of unprotected intercourse. However, there is no question that use of IUDs, implants, pills, and all of those things significantly reduce unintended pregnancy.
Thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll take sort of clusters of 3 questions at a time, and then the panelists can respond, and then we'll take the next cluster. So, please.
Thank you. My name is Kirsten Shirk, and I'm with IPASS. And before I get to my question, I think it's ironic that Health and Human Services does not consider contraception a preventive method, but the Agency for International Development does. And it'd be interesting to hear some thoughts about that later. But specifically, Sarah, I'm so with you on the frustration with the conflation between family planning and abortion. And I hear it a lot in our work. And yet, given our refrain in the past couple of days that abortion is a complex issue and it does not stand alone, how do we separate an emphasis on preventing unintended pregnancy from abortion without stigmatizing abortion, but more specifically to Kim's point, without stigmatizing women who need or choose to terminate an unintended pregnancy?
Thank you. We'll have another question. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Anita. I am an obstetrician. I work in Brazil, but I have worked in 3 different Latin American countries in the last 55 years. And I have problem to understand this country. You all agree that there are too many unintended pregnancies in this country. And we can see there that without substantial increase in the use of highly effective reversible method, there will be no decrease in unintended pregnancy rate. You have over 1 million abortions. Which are women who are telling you, if I get pregnant again, I will probably have another abortion, and I am not protected for unintended pregnancy. Is there any effort to provide family planning counseling, explaining that these methods are good, safe, effective, less costly than another abortion, and why there is not a post-abortion program of counseling and provision of these highly effective methods?
Thank you. Please.
My name is Jen Roth. I work for All Our Lives, and I'm
A little bit louder.
a little louder. Okay. Oh, there it is. I know. I hear
Thank
it.
you. Thank you.
I was wondering, various polls have shown that a large majority of people who identify as pro-life are in fact pro-contraception and see a place for the use of contraception in decreasing the abortion rate, and yet that's a perspective that's basically not seen in the public debate at all. I mean, that perspective wasn't even represented on this panel, which I find unfortunate. And I was wondering if there was a place in the public debate where those people who may not agree with abortion but who really want to work on contraception and on sex education could do that, could have their voices heard, that this would lead to a much greater increase in support for family planning and sex education, and why should there not be that place?
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that there is no lack of awareness of the very common pro-life, pro-contraception stance. You're right, it happens not to be sort of impersonated on this panel, but I think that we're well aware that many people who are pro-life are also open to contraception. But to answer the questions, Kim and Sarah, do you want to take the first two questions? And probably you may also have a perspective on the question raised by the Brazilian gentleman. Yes.
Okay. On the issue of distinguishing between contraception and abortion and what that does with regard to stigmatizing abortion, I understand the concern, but I also think we have to get the facts straight here. There is a difference. And I have a slide that actually shows, like, a line, sex, contraception, no contraception, pregnant, all this thing, because we have gotten so confused as a nation about just sort of the underlying biology of how this rolls out. I think we have to get clear about this. Then there is a separate second level question of what does that do to a wide variety of dimensions of life, including for women who choose abortion. I don't understand how getting clear between prevention and abortion, the difference and how they function in different domains, in different mechanisms, automatically leads to a further stigmatization of abortion. I think, in fact, it reduces it and may, in fact, thereby sort of decrease overall conflict. On the issue of, I think, abortion, as you pointed out, what it triggered in my mind is, here's something I bet most people don't know. About half of all abortions are to women who have had at least one previous abortion. Half. That suggests to me that not only the family planning systems, but also the people who provide terminations are not doing enough to prevent additional unintended pregnancies, including such things as immediate post-abortion IUD insertion. There are reasons why that's not done. Unfortunately, it has to do with things like insurance coverage, and it's just, we don't have to go into all this. But the fundamental issue here, in my view, that attaches to, that's one question, but there are others, is that we have, for about 20 years now, lacked a clear voice on pregnancy planning and prevention and contraception. And the void now has led to all sorts of these discontinuities, including the conflation of prevention and abortion, the inflated fears of devices. People think that the IUDs on the market now are the same as the old ones. They're not. There's just been radio silence, and I think bad news loves a vacuum. So what happens in the presence of that silence and confusion, go on the internet, and whatever you find, with a few exceptions, will be that contraception is a terrible, life-threatening event, which is simply not true. And it's because there's no counter-messaging, in my view.
So I'll say a couple of things. First, on this question of how drawing the distinction, or drawing a better factual distinction, absolutely, between family planning and abortion potentially has negative consequences for women. And part of what I think happens in a lot of our conversations about women in this country is that we work very hard to create categories of good women and bad women, of virtuous women and women who aren't virtuous, of women who deserve praise and women who don't deserve praise. And so one of the things I think we could imagine happening, Sarah, is that if you're smart enough to use contraception, you don't get pregnant, there's the good woman. right? And the bad woman is that person who ends up getting pregnant when we know she shouldn't have, right? And she had these tools available to her. So I do think we still find ourselves trying to figure out how to avoid letting that happen to women who are making legal choices in this country. The second thing that I wanted to say, which kind of goes to the last question that was asked, and a lot of my work is about assisted reproductive technology as well. I do a lot of reproductive rights work. And one of the things that I think is so difficult about all of these conversations about reproductive rights and reproductive choices is that abortion just swallows the whole, right? I mean, you just can't talk about baby making without talking about abortion. I mean, even the difficulty of talking about people having the right to become pregnant and to carry their pregnancies and to have access to prenatal care somehow becomes a conversation about abortion. And I think one of the things that we have to figure out is how we can stop doing that, how we can stop, how we can get ourselves to a point where we can have conversations about babies and baby making and women and not have it all devolve into, but what about abortion?
Okay, cluster of questions.
Can I answer to
Yeah.
that? I think also about the question here, I think it also has to do with the, how should I put it? It's a messy business, like about the question about whether someone really wanted to use contraception to prevent pregnancy. There's just, I think it shows that only 12% of women who cited the lack of contraception as a reason why they had an unplanned pregnancy. So it's actually more complicated than that. Women sometimes don't use, may have an unplanned pregnancy or basically have a sexual relationship, even though they don't want the children, they don't want to use contraceptive. It's kind of like a behavioral thing. They select trust, for example, that if I use contraceptive, then we're not trusting each other. So they could, there is many psychology involved in all that as well. And so that's why I think contraception is only an issue, but it's not the entire issue.
Thank you. My name is Jim Latimer. I'm a private citizen. One point that came up just now that it just occurred to me as a question is, could it be that the fact that Planned Parenthood, the famous Planned Parenthood, is always associated with abortions in terms of being a large, and it's called Planned Parenthood, there's a confusion between prevention and abortion right there, sort of intrinsic in the name. But the reason I would like some comment on that. The question I had was mainly to Father Joseph was, according to Catholic doctrine, is there a distinction between artificial contraception and natural methods? And finally, the second associated question, is it morally acceptable within marriage to use natural means of contraception to limit the size of the family or the space or the time between children? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Terry McKeegan with the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute. The assertion that was made by three of the panelists is that increased promotion and access to birth control leads to less unintended pregnancies and to less abortions. Looking at the figure that was offered by the first presenter, we see that 48% of all unintended pregnancies come from women using contraception. Now, this confirms a survey that was done that was quoted in the New York Times in 1991, where they surveyed all the women that had abortion, and they found out that more than half of them were using some form of artificial contraception at the time they became pregnant. My question is, where is the proof of this assertion that increased promotion and access to birth control actually leads to less unintended pregnancies and abortion? And I especially ask this question because another presenter said that we've had a non-system of family planning in this country for a number of decades. If that is the case, then what practice can we point to from this country or another country of implementing a comprehensive system of contraception that has actually been proven to reduce unintended pregnancies and abortion? Thank you.
Okay, great. Take one more, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
Thanks. My name is Brian Dixon. I have just a couple of questions. One very quick to Professor Trussell. In your conclusion, you mentioned that without a substantial increase in those three most effective, there will be no decrease in the unintended pregnancy rate. But if you could move if you could cut the number of women not using any method, say, in half, wouldn't that also, if they're responsible, if those 11% are responsible for half of the unintended pregnancies, wouldn't that make a big increase? Wouldn't that make a big impact as well? I certainly accept the general premise that we'll never seriously address it, but that would, I think, quickly have an impact as well. And my other question for Father Tham, I was intrigued by your discussion of freedom, which and maybe I misunderstood, but it struck me that people were free to do what you thought they should do. That, in your view, said people were free to do what's good and free to avoid what's bad, and then went on to say your idea of what's good for them. Would you accept that people have their own moral agency to make their own decisions about what's good for them, and that in some cases that may be different from your view of what's good for them?
Yes, absolutely. If we could, if the women who were using nothing moved to something, that would make a considerable dent in the rate of unintended pregnancy as well. And my hope is that getting contraception declared as a preventive health services would enable women who can't afford contraception to be able to use it. As a matter of proof that artificial contraception reduces unintended pregnancy, is really a simple matter of arithmetic. Let's suppose that there were no artificial contraception, and people were then faced with two choices. One would be to use nothing, in which case 85% of them would become pregnant in a year, as opposed to the percentages that you saw who got pregnant while using those different methods. Or they would use periodic abstinence, in which case in the United States about 30% of them become pregnant in 1 year. 30% is very high compared to all of those other rates. So it really is a simple matter of arithmetic. You don't have to be you don't have to be a rocket scientist to arrive at that conclusion.
Can I comment a little, just a bit on this issue of use and non-use? The slide that Professor Trussell showed of half of the women having abortions had not used a method and half had.
Unintended pregnancies.
Pardon me? I mean, unintended pregnancies, excuse me. Half had and half haven't. It's like everything else in this field, it's actually a little more complicated than that. For the women who are shown as having not used contraception, if you look at their contraceptive histories for the previous year, many of them have used methods. They've used some, they stopped, they started, they stopped, they started. It's not as though they're just sort of chronic non-users over years or even months. And of the women who have used, that doesn't mean that they've used it correctly or exactly right. They missed a pill, they didn't, whatever. The point is simply this. In order to prevent unintended pregnancy through the use of contraception, the woman, the couple, has to be really, really diligent. Really diligent. 60% of the time, Tuesday but not Saturday, yeah, maybe with this guy, that's not going to do it. And by our silence about contraception and its benefits and the details of it, we have now large numbers of men and women who really just don't understand how this all works. And so these sort of categories of use or non-use, I understand them and they're helpful. But what they really display, if you look behind it into the lives of the individuals, is a generation of sort of not understanding how all this works and not understanding that most of the time isn't adequate, which of course returns to the value of these longer acting methods, among other things.
Okay, about the difference between artificial birth control and natural methods. Actually, the natural methods, according to Catholic teaching, is not a form of contraception. It's about spacing, and it's about this complicated way of explaining it. But basically, it's the spacing requires an abstinence, periodic abstinence in your marriage. So it's not, in a strict sense, doing something. You're abstaining from doing your sexual act. And so, in that sense, it's acceptable in marriage. And so there's no problem with that. And I think there's also more methods of they call fertility awareness. That's a new term they use instead of natural family planning. That has been shown to be quite effective if applied correctly. Method effectiveness, when you say effectiveness, is almost comparable to modern birth control pills. As a question about freedom and truth, and that's a great question. Not easy to answer because it actually, the church believes that there is kind of objective truth about our human nature that we all aspire to. Whether we reach that or not, that is a matter of individual choices and what they do. The church is not saying that you have always live up to that, but there's kind of written within our human nature, there's certain things written within our hearts that we are called towards that direction. So in that sense, we are free, basically, to live according to that truth that is written within us, but we're also free to not live in according to that, and that's basically the traditional term is sin. You're free to sin. But that doesn't it makes you less human in some way, because that's not what you're called to. So there's always, not everybody agrees with that, this objective nature, objective truth that somehow lays within our human nature that we need to discover. And that's I think the difference.
Do you know the percentage of Catholic women who in fact use birth control and therefore who are in fact in this condition of sin? Do you know the numbers?
I think that a lot of women use birth control in the Catholic Church. I don't have the latest statistics, but they say about, in terms of using, natural family planning, it's about 3% of Catholics use that, the natural methods.
3% use natural, but not exactly sure how many use
Yes.
we're not calling artificial.
Yeah.
Okay, questions?
Father Matthias, Catholic priest from Toronto. My question is for James. Amongst all the different categories of unintended pregnancy, do you have any statistics on how much is outside of marriage and how much is inside marriage? First question. Second question is, when we talk about contraceptive methods, it's the last one, the sure ones that you're talking about, are they really contraceptive or are they abortive? They just prevent the embryo to implant in the uterus, or are they effectively contraceptive? Because there will be difference between, perhaps it might not be just contraceptive, but it will just be abortive. That's my question. And then for another question to Kim, would be, you talked about abstinence program to protect yourself, but do you think there are abstinence programs where there is this ideal of what Father Joseph talked about, the ideal of love? Do you think there are programs like that? And another question is, do you think it would be feasible to put those kind of things in that abstinence program? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Next.
My name is Joe Morshid, I'm a Fordham University student. It seems that well, of course, in my experience and also in agreement with the group here, that the direct cause of unplanned pregnancies is basically whipping out the baby maker without expecting to make babies. And as a college student, I'm very familiar with hookup culture, and it seems that this is the intuitive direct cause. So I have two questions. First to Father. Contraception is clearly if used right, an effective treatment of this. So why is this either insufficient or a wrong treatment of it? To the rest of the group, contraception is only a treatment, it seems. It doesn't, of course, take away this culture that does the baby-making act while thinking that the natural consequence of that isn't making babies. So how do we get to a real solution to this? How might we address the actual culture that separates the act from the consequence?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Andres Duran. I'm a Fordham undergraduate student. And my question is, this is for the panel in general, can't the unwantedness, like the actual unwantedness of certain pregnancies be seen as a consequence of the enormous societal stigma on pregnancies occurring outside of some white picket fence romantic ideal, and the lack of options given to pregnant women other than termination? And if so, what can be done to create a culture wherein pregnancy and motherhood are valued as essential aspects of femininity, and women are able to live that true femininity in socioeconomic freedom.
Thank you. Take one more question, then we'll have the panel response. Thank you.
I'm Angela Pfister, and I'm with the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. And my question is more specifically for Father Tham. You spoke a bit in terms of, actually the overarching theme was the Catholic Church's view on contraception, but you spoke in terms of reason. Could you speak perhaps to the possibility of embracing the views held by the Catholic Church, but not necessarily being a person of faith, or speaking of it in terms of sin?
Thank you. I want to start on this end of the panel. I want to also note that although our time is coming short, we did begin a few minutes late to enable people to move from the other building to here, so we are going to go about 5 minutes longer than the official time, just to make up that time and enable our audience to ask some more questions.
Okay, about the last question, actually the basis of why the Catholic Church believes that contraception is wrong within marriage is actually a reason-based argument. It's not really a religious-based argument at all. Obviously, it's not an easy argument to make. It's based on natural law, but it has to do with, to simplify, I don't have a lot of time, but basically it's saying that the love-making and the life-giving aspect are intrinsically present in every sexual act, that you cannot separate love from life in every individual lovemaking. So if you separate that, then it's actually, one professor gave this example. It's almost like, he gave the example said, okay, they have a couple here, and the woman realized that she doesn't like the man's face or his nose, and during lovemaking, she asked that, no, will you cover your face? Okay, that would be kind of like saying, I don't accept a part of you in lovemaking. I like you, but I don't like your face. Okay, and in some way, according to this vision, you will basically be rejecting the fertility aspect in lovemaking in women, for example, when she uses the pill, because you say, I love you, but not totally. I don't love your fertility. So it's kind of like saying we have the love-making part, but we reject the life-giving potential that is basically intrinsically present in every sexual act. So that's the reason, more or less, why the Catholic Church rejects contraception. The other question about why the church is against also contraception, even in the premarital stage, like college. Basically, it's once again that idea that we are called to something higher. That if sex is not just something casual, it's something very sublime, and it's only to be done within the marital bond, then if you're doing it outside of that, it's basically an inferior calling. And contraception, in that sense, obviously, is only a band-aid solution. Right? It doesn't really address the deeper issue about what it means to have true love.
Thank you. Alice?
Well, I wanted to comment on the question about sort of current culture. I think you raised it about, I don't know, my own interpretation is that, or let me just address it this way. This personal position, I do not think that the current model of sexual engagement amongst young adults is working very well for the men or the women. I don't think it really actually has much to do with contraception. I think they're actually quite different discussions. But in all the work that we do with young adults, I'm talking mainly about single young adults, I think there's a sense that maybe the old model wasn't working, and a lot of hypocrisy about what people thought they should do or said they were doing, what they were actually doing, and so forth. But I'm not sure that the new model is working particularly well either. I think we're in a period of great change where people understand the promise of contraception. They reject the notion that only married people can have sex lives and so forth. But sort of how this rolls out on Saturday night is, I don't think we've got a model that is universally respected and supported. And I really think that a lot of the conversation that should be occurring is not so much about who's in favor or not in favor of birth control. People vote with their feet in this country. They feel very strongly that it's important, including a large proportion of evangelical Christians. I think the issue that's troubling us more sometimes is what's the overall social relationship, personal context in which sexual activity occurs, particularly amongst unmarried people. And, you know, every time we work with the entertainment media in Hollywood, you know, this whole issue of has sex become coarser, less meaningful, no consequences shown. I mean, these are important topics, and I think that's a larger picture here that really merits more discussion. I think that's really what's more on the table than whether people do or don't approve of postponing pregnancy.
Do the panelists have a comment before we get the last question?
Can I just say a couple of really quick things?
Yes, absolutely.
One, I just want to push back on the idea that true femininity is about motherhood, right? So let me just reject that. And then the second thing was the question that was asked about whether I think that an abstinence program or that a sex education program is a program that could also talk about love and those sorts of things. Absolutely, right? I mean, I think if you talk about something being comprehensive, you want to think about sort of the broad range of issues that go into how and why people become sexually active and with whom. And I think that somebody who's really good at their job as a teacher can have those really rich conversations with students. And on top of that, as a person who's raising a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old who at some point, right, are going to be having sex, I think that's absolutely part of the conversations that parents would have with their kids as well. So I think these are good things.
I had a question about the mechanism of action of these highly effective contraceptives. We can't rule out the possibility, although we can fairly confidently say they don't work very often, if at all, in this way, but we can't absolutely rule out the possibility that there is no post-fertilization effect, that there would be fertilization but no pregnancy. But I would point out to everyone here, the same can be said about the contraceptive effect of breastfeeding. There's quite good evidence that it has a post-fertilization effect. No, because the definition of abortion in the United States is the disruption of an established pregnancy. It has nothing to do about fertilized eggs.
The pregnancy is defined as
fertilization.
After implantation.
Pregnancy in the United States by law is defined as implantation, not fertilization.
And the statistics between the inside marriage and outside marriage of the...
They're available, but I don't remember. Do you remember?
I don't have it that way. I mean, the things like we know that 7 in 10 pregnancies to unmarried women are reported as unintended, but that's not the way you asked it. That has a different denominator. But 20% of abortions are to married women. So, this is not just unmarried. This is a widely distributed phenomenon of unintended pregnancy and how it's resolved.
Okay, so I'm going to take the next few, but no one else get in line, please. Okay, so everyone ask your question as quickly as you can, and we'll get the audience, the panelists to respond.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, first of all, Father Joseph, thanks for being here. Challenging position, really. So I appreciate that. I also understand your ideals about love, but surely you recognize how many people don't live up to those standards when it comes to sex. And then there's the reality that, at least as far as the data that I've seen, that Catholic American women are just as likely to use birth control as non-Catholic women. So now I'm going to ask you to stretch your imagination. Let's say that I, Jewish Rachel, am Catholic. And not only Catholic, but I'm well-respected and well-intended and very respectful of my church and everything else. And I want to start, just genuinely, I want to start a conversation about these discrepancies and just begin to talk about it. I want to know where you would advise me strategically to just begin to have such conversation.
Hi, my name's Rose Daly, and I'm a student at St. Louis University. And as a college student, women my age are constantly targeted by people who are promoting contraception and also choosing to end their abortion, to end their pregnancy in abortion if it is unintended, because that'll help them carry out their education. And this is told to us. It's told that it's a form of empowerment for women. But as soon as that woman chooses to keep her child and carry it through the term of pregnancy, and then even keep it through their college experience, those people who are saying we can help you, we can help empower you, kind of step out of the picture, and they're no longer there. And so I was wondering if this is the case, do people who want to empower women step out of the picture as soon as that girl, especially my age, want help to keep their child and to continue?
Thank you.
My name is Susanna Seibert. I attend Villanova University. My question is for Professor Mutcherson. You said that it seems impossible to dream of a world without abortion, but that you do dream of a world without violence against women, without gender oppression. And I was just wondering what you'd respond to the argument that abortion and birth control are violence against women because they are unnatural and invade her body either chemically or physically. Just how you respond to that discussion.
Hi, Alexis Kende. I work with the World Youth Alliance. So I work with a lot of young people, and as I'm hearing you speak, I'm thinking many of you have said that abstinence is, and it's logical, the surest way to prevent a lot of these problems that we're talking about. How can we promote this to young people without, if we offer contraception more widely and talk about these other methods, how does that affect their reaching for the ideal, at least, that we can all see is clearly most effective and most respective of their humanity? How can we help them to strive for that ideal and understanding that people fall short when we're also promoting these other methods?
Thank you. Last question.
Hi. I'm sorry, this isn't about an unintended pregnancy. Background, I'm a college student at a secular university, but I am Catholic and I practice chastity. Professor Mutcherson, you mentioned in the beginning you were talking about how women have rights to their own reproductive organs and their own sexuality. But when you were talking about why women aren't using their contraception, you said that women may have it, but their sexual partners may not be open to them using it. And I was wondering how that is empowering. Like, how is that them taking ownership of their own sexuality if they're engaging in sex with something that they're not in agreement with? And yes, and I'm sorry, just a point for Rachel. I'm, like I said, in a secular university, and our Catholic Center next Tuesday, our entire topic is chastity, and it's being put on by college students, and we're talking with the brothers and the sisters and the father. So it is talked about, at least in the younger population, actually a lot, which is nice. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. So the question did not get any easier or less provocative. Your last chance, panelists.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
So the two questions that were directed at me were sort of generally about this question of women's empowerment and how I think about reproductive rights in that context. So for the second question, there's nothing empowering about being in a sexual relationship with someone with whom you cannot negotiate that sex. Done. Right? That is not an empowering relationship, and that's not about birth control. That's about something else. And then the other question was how I can reconcile my feelings about violence against women with abortion and birth control, and the fact that some people will configure those things as violence against women. So part of my response to that is, as I said, I have 2 kids, both of whom were born via C-section, which is a major invasive form of surgery. And certainly if I had not consented to that, that would have been violence, right? And obviously I would have substantial issues with having been subjected to that. But the fact that something is invasive does not, standing alone, somehow create it as a violent act, right? I mean, there are lots of different things that happen to us and that happen to our bodies that in many ways can be can be difficult, right? It's a long road recovering from a C-section, but that doesn't mark it as violence in the way that I am talking about violence against women.
A lot of these questions sort of blended together in my mind. Maybe it's lunchtime, and we're all hypoglycemic. So this issue of respecting women, I think it was a young woman who's currently an undergraduate, about women who would get pregnant and carry the child to term and all that. I don't think there's anybody at this meeting that doesn't respect that choice and believe that those young women and the men involved in the families deserve support and honor and services and support. I don't think that's at issue. That doesn't mean that that's what happens in real life, but I think all of us would aspire to true freedom of choice, not choice in the political word, but people making the decisions and then garnering respect and support for whatever they do, which includes the choice of chastity or abstinence. I think even people who are very, very on the contraception front lines would respect deeply somebody who chooses not to be sexually active. So the issue is really, I think, availability of options and people being honored for what they choose to do. I understand that doesn't always happen, but I think we need to lay that out and aspire to that as well, just as we respect the right of individuals to use contraception, and in my view, indeed, to also elect abortion if that's their choice. There are many, many, many different pathways, and I think that they all have their own merit and are not to be stigmatized.
Thank you.
The question about where we could have this conversation taking place. I have mixed feelings about this. I think, on one hand, I think it's important to have that kind of conversation going on. On the other hand, it's very hard because there's so many different parties and the history is very long. I mean, the Catholic Church on this issue is almost like a taboo subject in church today on contraception. So priests don't talk about it, unfortunately. And I remember 2 years ago when I tried to organize basically in my university, it was the 40th anniversary of Humanimite. I tried to organize a interdisciplinary kind of discussion on this topic, and I couldn't get anyone. I mean, in university, I said, "Oh, this is too controversial." I mean, it's hard. It's very hard to talk about that, and I couldn't find anyone who. So at the end, I said, "Okay." Everyone was like, "Okay, that's a great idea, but you do it." It's almost like. At the end, basically, I said, "Well, I didn't get any support," and I basically couldn't carry that through. And so that's I think it's a challenge. You have some ideas? You can talk about it over lunch. After lunch, yeah. You can think about it and.
I just have to note, because I'm a parent, as is Kim, and my daughter has already told me that she intends not to use birth control. She's 13. Her reason, though, is quite unique. Her reason is that she says, "Mommy, I want to give all my eggs an equal chance." Thank you. Trussell